Right now, as I speak to you, 20,000 human beings are trapped on ships in the Persian Gulf, caught in the crossfire of one of the most dangerous maritime crises our modern world has ever witnessed. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow passage of water that the entire global economy depends upon, has become a war zone. Iran has effectively closed it, threatening to set ablaze any vessel that dares to pass through. This is not some distant geopolitical chess game. This is a humanitarian emergency unfolding in real time, with missiles and drones flying overhead while cargo ship crews huddle below deck, wondering if they will ever see their families again. The United Nations has just announced emergency talks to establish a humanitarian corridor, but for the sailors stranded on both sides of that strait, every passing hour brings new dangers and diminishing hope. I want you to understand the sheer scale of what we are witnessing in the Persian Gulf right now. Hundreds of tankers and commercial vessels sit completely idle, their engines cold, their crews growing increasingly desperate. These are not military personnel trained for combat situations. Now, these are ordinary working people, merchant mariners who signed up to transport goods across oceans, not to become hostages in an international standoff. Since Iran's Revolutionary Guard declared the Strait of Hormuz closed on March 2nd, at least 15 tankers have been targeted in attacks. 5 crew members have already lost their lives when 2 vessels were struck. 5 families somewhere in the world received the worst possible news, all because their loved ones happened to be doing their jobs in the wrong stretch of water at the wrong moment in history. The international maritime community is scrambling to respond, but the situation grows more perilous with each passing day. The economic ramifications of this crisis extend far beyond anything most analysts initially predicted when the strait closure began. The International Energy Agency has officially labeled this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Think about that statement for a moment. In all the decades of oil embargoes, regional conflicts, and production disputes, nothing has matched what is happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz. Insurance companies have withdrawn war risk coverage entirely, which means that even ship operators willing to brave the danger cannot economically justify sending their vessels through. Commercial traffic has plunged to almost nothing, with the exception of Iranian and Chinese flagged ships that continue to move through under different arrangements. Iran later modified its position, announcing it would keep the strait closed specifically to ships from the United States, Israel, and their Western allies, while selectively permitting passage for certain other nations. This selective enforcement has created a bizarre and unpredictable situation for the global shipping industry. Turkey reported that Iran approved the passage of a Turkish ship through the strait, suggesting some diplomatic channels remain open. Indian flag gas carriers have also been permitted through, along with a Saudi oil tanker carrying 1 million barrels of crude destined specifically for India. So we have this strange patchwork emerging where some vessels can pass and others cannot, based entirely on political relationships rather than commercial considerations. The uncertainty alone is devastating to global trade planning. Ship operators cannot make reliable schedules. Commodity traders cannot guarantee deliveries. And meanwhile, those 20,000 seafarers remain stranded, their fate hanging on diplomatic negotiations that could take weeks or months to produce results. The humanitarian dimension of this crisis demands immediate attention, which is precisely why the United Nations Maritime Organization has launched these emergency talks. The human cost of this standoff cannot be measured merely in economic statistics or barrel counts. Every single one of those stranded seafarers has a story, a family waiting anxiously for news, children asking when their parent is coming home. Merchant shipping is already one of the most isolating professions in the world, with crews spending months away from loved ones under normal circumstances. Now add the terror of being trapped in what has become an active conflict zone, with no clear timeline for resolution and the constant threat of attack hanging over every vessel. The psychological toll on these crews must be immense, and yet their plight receives far less attention than the fluctuations in oil prices or the diplomatic maneuvering between world powers. I believe we have a moral obligation to keep these 20,000 human beings at the center of this story because ultimately they are the ones paying the highest price for decisions made by governments thousands of miles away from their stranded ships. The ripple effects of the Strait of Hormuz closure are now washing across every continent, disrupting supply chains that most people never even knew existed. When we talk about this critical waterway, most minds immediately go to oil, and understandably so. But the truth is far more alarming when you examine the complete picture of what flows through that narrow strait. Nearly 50% of all global urea and sulfur exports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. These are not exotic commodities that only specialists care about. Urea and sulfur are the foundational ingredients in fertilizers, the chemical building blocks that make modern agriculture possible. Without reliable fertilizer supplies, crop yields plummet, food production drops, and prices skyrocket at grocery stores around the world. The farmers in Kansas and the rice growers in Vietnam are connected to this crisis, whether they realize it or not. I have been tracking the assessments coming from international food security organizations, and the warnings are genuinely frightening. The United Nations World Food Program has stated that this disruption is already driving significant long term increases in global food prices. They are drawing direct comparisons to the food crisis of 2022, when supply chain disruptions sent shockwaves through agricultural markets worldwide. We saw protests and political instability in multiple countries during that period, all stemming from the simple fact that people could not afford to feed their families. Now we face the prospect of repeating that nightmare, potentially on an even larger scale, because the Strait of Hormuz handles such an enormous share of critical agricultural inputs. The fertilizer shortage will not hit immediately, but the effects will compound over growing seasons, creating a slow motion catastrophe that could take years to fully recover from. The energy dimension of this crisis presents its own set of cascading consequences that extend well beyond crude oil. Approximately 30% of Europe's jet fuel supply originates from or transits through the Strait of Hormuz. Aviation is already one of the most economically sensitive sectors in the global economy, operating on razor thin margins even in good times. A sustained disruption to jet fuel supplies will force airlines to cut routes, raise prices, and potentially ground portions of their fleets. Business, travel, tourism, cargo transport, everything that depends on aviation will suffer. And this comes at a time when European economies were already struggling with the aftermath of previous energy shocks. The continent has spent enormous resources trying to diversify its energy supplies and build resilience into its systems. Now, the Strait of Hormuz crisis threatens to undo much of that progress by exposing just how interconnected and vulnerable global energy infrastructure remains despite all efforts at reform. The International Energy Agency has responded to this emergency with the largest coordinated release of strategic petroleum reserves in history. 400 million barrels will be released over 120 days, a massive intervention designed to cushion the blow of lost supply. But here is the sobering reality that analysts have pointed out, and I think it deserves careful attention. That enormous release of strategic reserves equals only about 20 days of normal traffic flow through the Strait of Hormuz. 20 days. So even this unprecedented emergency measure cannot come close to replacing the lost function of the disrupted shipping corridor. Strategic reserves were designed to handle temporary disruptions, not sustained closures of critical choke points. If the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed for months, the global oil market will face structural shortages that no amount of reserve releases can adequately address. We are truly in uncharted territory now. The geopolitical ramifications are equally troubling as nations scramble to adapt to this new reality. The United Kingdom has sent military planners to work directly with the United States on developing what officials describe as a viable collective plan to reopen the waterway. The language is deliberately vague, but the implication is clear. Western powers are actively considering military options to forcibly restore transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Such an operation would carry enormous risks, potentially escalating an already dangerous situation into full scale regional conflict. Iran has demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to strike vessels attempting passage, and any military convoy operation would face constant harassment at minimum. The stakes could not be higher because miscalculation on either side could trigger a conflagration that engulfs the entire Middle East. Yet the economic pressure to restore oil flows is also intense and growing more desperate by the day. The nations of Asia are experiencing the most severe consequences of the Strait of Hormuz crisis, and the numbers tell a story of profound vulnerability that decades of economic planning failed to adequately address. Japan relies on the Middle East for approximately 90% of its crude oil imports, and the overwhelming majority of those shipments transit directly through the Strait of Hormuz. Consider what that dependency means in practical terms. One of the world's largest and most technologically advanced economies has built its entire energy infrastructure around a single maritime choke point that is now effectively closed to Western aligned shipping. Japanese industry, transportation, power generation, and heating all depend on a steady flow of Middle Eastern oil that has suddenly become unreliable. This is the nightmare scenario that energy security experts have warned about for decades, now unfolding in real time with no clear resolution in sight. South Korea faces a similarly precarious situation, though its dependency is slightly less extreme than Japan's. Approximately 70% of South Korea's crude oil comes from the Middle East, again transiting primarily through the Strait of Hormuz. The Korean government has responded with a massive intervention, activating a 100 trillion one market stabilization program designed to cushion the economic impact of supply disruptions. That translates to roughly $75 billion committed to preventing economic chaos. Korean manufacturers, particularly in the petrochemical and automotive sectors, are scrambling to secure alternative supplies and adjust production schedules. Some factories have already begun cutting shifts and scaling back output to conserve fuel supplies. The ripple effects are spreading through supply chains that connect Korean manufacturing to consumer markets across the globe, threatening everything from electronics production to automobile manufacturing that so many other industries depend upon. China presents perhaps the most interesting and consequential case study in how major powers are adapting to the Strait of Hormuz crisis. As the world's largest oil importer, China has enormous exposure to any disruption in Middle Eastern supplies. But unlike Japan and South Korea, China appears to be finding alternative arrangements that partially insulate its economy from the worst effects. Reports indicate that Chinese flagged vessels continue to transit the strait with Iranian permission, maintaining at least some flow of oil to Chinese refineries. More significantly, China has begun pivoting towards substantially increased Russian crude supplies as Middle Eastern barrels become inaccessible to other buyers. This shift represents a fundamental realignment of global energy trade flows, one that analysts say is significantly improving Russia's competitive position in international energy markets. The strategic implications of this China Russia energy axis forming in response to the Strait of Hormuz closure deserve serious consideration. Russia has been seeking alternatives to European markets ever since Western sanctions disrupted its traditional customer base. Now, the Hormuz crisis is delivering exactly what Moscow wanted, a massive new customer base in Asia forced to turn to Russian supplies by circumstances beyond their control. Chinese buyers who previously balanced their imports across multiple Middle Eastern and Russian sources are now tilting decisively toward Russia. This gives Moscow leverage and revenue that will help sustain its economy through ongoing sanctions pressure. Meanwhile, the Western allies who had hoped to isolate Russia economically are watching their strategy partially undermined by a crisis in a completely different region. The interconnected nature of global energy markets means that a disruption in one choke point creates opportunities elsewhere that adversaries can exploit. I want to return to the humanitarian dimension because I believe it deserves constant emphasis amid all the discussion of barrels and billions. Those 20,000 seafarers trapped on vessels throughout the Persian Gulf are not abstract statistics. They are human beings enduring extraordinary stress and danger through no fault of their own. Many come from developing nations in Southeast Asia and South Asia, where merchant marine work represents one of the few paths to middle class income and stability. They took these jobs to support their families, to send remittances home, to build better futures for their children. Now they find themselves imprisoned on ships surrounded by hostile waters, watching missiles trace arcs across the night sky. The United Nations negotiations for a humanitarian corridor cannot come soon enough for these desperate crews. Every day of delay means another day of psychological trauma, another day of physical danger, another day of families back home checking their phones constantly for any scrap of news about their loved ones. The insurance industry's response to the Strait of Hormuz crisis reveals just how fundamentally the maritime world has changed in mere weeks. War risk coverage, that specialized form of insurance that allows vessels to transit dangerous waters, has essentially evaporated for the strait. No major insurer will underwrite voyages through a waterway where missiles and drones actively target commercial shipping Without insurance, ship owners face unlimited personal liability for any losses. Even the most daring or desperate operators cannot justify sending billion-dollar vessels and irreplaceable human crews into harm's way without financial protection. This single factor, the withdrawal of insurance coverage, has achieved what military force alone might not have. It has effectively paralyzed commercial shipping through one of the world's most important waterways without a single shot being fired at the insurers themselves. The pen has proven mightier than the sword. The selective nature of Iran's enforcement policy has created a strange hierarchy among the world's shipping fleets. Iranian vessels continue operating without impediment, as one would expect. Chinese flagged ships have reportedly received permission to transit, reflecting the close strategic partnership between Beijing and Tehran. Turkey secured passage for at least one vessel, suggesting Ankara's careful diplomatic balancing act is paying dividends. India has emerged as another nation enjoying relatively favorable treatment, with Indian flagged gas carriers and even a Saudi tanker carrying crude destined for Indian markets allowed through. This last point is particularly interesting. Saudi Arabia and Iran have long been regional rivals, yet a Saudi tanker received permission because its cargo was bound for India rather than Western markets. The message from Tehran seems clear. This is about punishing the United States and its closest allies, not about closing the strait to all commerce universally. Western nations have found themselves in an uncomfortable position, caught between the need to respond forcefully and the risks of military escalation. The United Kingdom's decision to send military planners to coordinate with American counterparts signals serious consideration of forced reopening options. Naval analysts have been speculating about what such an operation might look like. Mine-sweeping operations would certainly be required, given reports of Iranian mining activity in the strait. Continuous air cover would be necessary to protect convoys from drone and missile attacks. Submarines would need to hunt for any underwater threats lurking in the shallow waters. The logistics alone are staggering, and the risks of escalation are even more daunting. Any military casualties on either side would create pressure for retaliation and expansion of hostilities. The 5 crew members who have already died in attacks on vessels deserve recognition and remembrance amid all the strategic calculations. These were working people doing honest labor when violence found them. Their deaths represent the terrible human cost that accumulates whenever political disputes turn violent, and they are unlikely to be the last casualties if this crisis continues without resolution. The longer those hundreds of ships remain stranded, the longer crews are exposed to danger. Accidents happen even under normal maritime conditions. Mechanical failures, medical emergencies, fires, all the ordinary hazards of life at sea become exponentially more dangerous when rescue services cannot reach distressed vessels, when helicopters cannot safely operate, when every movement draws the attention of forces ready to interpret any action as hostile. The maritime environment around the Strait of Hormuz has become a trap, where even routine problems can turn deadly. The diplomatic path forward remains frustratingly unclear as competing interests and demands complicate every potential arrangement. Iran has demonstrated that it possesses both the capability and the willingness to enforce its closure declaration. The Revolutionary Guard's threat to set ablaze any unauthorized vessel has proven credible, given the attacks that have already occurred. Meanwhile, Iran clearly wants to maintain some commerce flow, hence the selective permissions granted to China, Turkey, India, and others. This suggests there may be room for negotiation, some arrangement that satisfies Iranian demands while allowing critical humanitarian and commercial traffic to resume. But reaching such an arrangement requires diplomatic creativity and flexibility from all parties, qualities that have been in short supply throughout this escalating confrontation. The United Nations emergency talks represent perhaps the best hope for finding a peaceful resolution, but the negotiations will be complex, contentious, and time-consuming while crews remain stranded. The long-term strategic implications of the Strait of Hormuz crisis will reshape global energy policy for decades to come, regardless of how the immediate situation is ultimately resolved. Every nation that witnessed the chaos of these weeks will be forced to reconsider assumptions about supply chain security and diversification. The vulnerability exposed by this crisis cannot be unseen or forgotten. Major economies built their entire energy infrastructure around the assumption that critical maritime choke points would remain open during peacetime, protected by international law and the mutual economic interest of all parties. That assumption has now been shattered. The Strait of Hormuz was not supposed to close like this. Yet here we are, watching the global economy scramble to adapt to exactly the scenario that planners considered too catastrophic to seriously prepare for. The 20,000 seafarers stranded in the Persian Gulf embody the human dimension of global trade in a way that economic statistics never capture. These are individuals from nations around the world connected by their profession and now united by their shared predicament. Filipino engineers, Indian officers, Ukrainian deckhands, Indonesian cooks. The merchant marine has always been one of the most internationally diverse workforces on Earth. That diversity means the stranding crisis touches communities in dozens of countries simultaneously. Families in Manila, Mumbai, Odessa, and Jakarta all wait anxiously for news. Governments from maritime nations, large and small, have been pressing for humanitarian access to their citizens. The United Nations negotiations must account for this complex web of nationalities and interests while seeking a solution that can actually be implemented in a hostile environment. The food security dimension of this crisis deserves final emphasis because its effects will outlast the immediate headlines. When fertilizer supplies are disrupted, the consequences do not appear immediately on grocery store shelves. They manifest months later, after planting seasons have passed, after crops have grown smaller than expected, after harvests have disappointed. The Strait of Hormuz carries nearly half the world's urea and sulfur exports, the building blocks of modern fertilizers. Every week, this disruption continues. Somewhere in the world, a farmer is unable to access the inputs needed for optimal crop production. Those shortfalls will compound through global food systems, eventually reaching consumers as higher prices and reduced availability. The poorest and most vulnerable populations always suffer most when food prices spike, creating humanitarian crises that receive far less attention than oil market gyrations, but inflict far greater human suffering. I think about what this crisis reveals about the fragility of the systems we have constructed to organize global commerce and cooperation. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that tiny gap flows the lifeblood of industrial civilization, the oil and gas and chemicals that power our factories, heat our homes, and feed our fields. We built our entire global economy around the assumption that narrow waterway would always remain open. And for decades, that assumption held because everyone, even bitter rivals, recognized that closing the strait would harm them as much as their enemies. That mutual deterrence has now broken down. Someone has decided that the costs of closure are acceptable, that the pain inflicted on adversaries outweighs the damage to their own interests. Once that calculation changes for one choke point, it can change for others as well. The ultimate resolution of the Strait of Hormuz crisis remains uncertain as diplomatic efforts continue and military options are quietly assessed. The United Nations negotiations represent the best hope for a peaceful outcome that prioritizes humanitarian concerns and allows the gradual restoration of commercial traffic, but negotiations take time, and time is exactly what those stranded seafarers do not have in abundance. Every day brings new dangers, new psychological trauma, new separation from the families they love. The world's attention will inevitably drift to other stories, other crises, other controversies. I hope we can maintain focus on the 20,000 human beings trapped in that dangerous waterway because they cannot simply change the channel or scroll to the next headline. They are living this nightmare every minute of every day, waiting for the rest of us to care enough to help them escape it.